нужен ли нам мир? Конечно, потому что мы мирные люди. Мы строим дома, мы строим города, мы пашем землю, мы любим друг друга, мы любим радоваться, мы очень мирный народ. Но не мы принесли на нашу землю Новороссию войну, не мы не развязали этот геноцид, не мы стали давить других людей по признаку языка, расы, культуры, ориентации. Мы были готовы принять Украину, если бы нам дали возможность быть там русскими. Но нас лишили этой возможности. Не мы начали эту войну, но мы ее закончим, когда мы победим. Слава России! Слава Новороссии! Слава великому русскому народу и его героям!
И мы, скорее всего, родились в мире, где любовь еще была, и в мире любви больше не будет.
Никогда в России, когда она была империей, не было ни межрелигиозных, ни межнациональных, ни межконфессиональных конфликтов. Кто давал людям и религиям, этносам и культурам возможность жить в мире? Империя. Кто объединял нас? Империя. Кто спасал нас? Империя. Сегодня есть разные люди, которые хотят нанести удар по России. Великая мощь Соединенных Штатов Америки, которая, согласно нашим православным канонам, есть царство Антихриста. И есть вторая, естественно, те люди, которые являются проводниками этого темного царства, царства мертвых, находящегося на Крайнем Западе. Там, куда пал темница. Не случайно в обряде православного крещения каждый крещаемый поворачивается на запад, простирает руки и говорит: отрицаешься ли сатаны, спрашивает его священник. Обращаясь к Америке, он говорит: отрицаюсь сатаны. Его спрашивает второй раз: отрицаешься ли сатаны и ангелов его? Отрицаюсь, отвечает крещаемый. И в третий раз спрашивает священник человека, получающего просветление: отрицаешься ли сатаны, обратившись на запад Соединенных Штатов Америки? И он отвечает: отрицаюсь.
And welcome to another episode of Fascio podcast, guys. Today with the co-host, we're having Mansolo, and our guest is Machado from New Resistance, a Brazilian fourth political theory organization. I'm going to go ahead and let him introduce himself.
Thank you, Zoltanous. First, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I actually feel honored for it. Second, I'd like to ask you to forgive me for any language complications. I know some English, but I'm not actually accustomed to talk in English, just reading, translating, and hearing stuff, etc. As Zoltanous said, my name is Raphael Machado. I'm the president or leader of the Brazilian organization Nova Resistência, or in English, New Resistance. And our mission or identity, or I don't know, ideology, or what we actually want to do is to create, and we are doing it, create a Brazilian adaptation of the fourth political theory, of Dugin's fourth political theory, but adapted to, Latin America and stuff. Well, besides that, I own a publishing house. I'm actually Dugin's Portuguese translator. And I also edit a blog, Legio Victrix, which I think it's the major Portuguese language dissident, article bibliothèque. So we have there articles from Dugin, Alain de Benoit, Diego Fusaro, Alain Soral, Freda, and all these other guys you obviously know and study and read.
All right, that is definitely interesting. I also know you guys translated one of my articles that got posted on a blog, so I'm very grateful for that.
Yes,
yeah.
It's an excellent article, by the way.
Oh, thank you. So, like, you guys are one of the very few fourth political theory organizations. A lot of people say stuff about the fourth political theory. Some of it's kind of like crazy out there, especially within some of the white nationalist circles. But then obviously you have liberals who kind of like kvetch at it. But could you tell us what the fourth political theory actually is?
Okay, I think that as simply as possible, it is basically an attempt to overcome hegemonic liberalism, which is actually the hegemonic ideology, postmodern liberalism. There's a lot of titles or names to the ideology which actually rules the world. Some people call it, I don't know, like doing post-liberalism. There are people who call it progressism, political correctness, or turbo capitalism, etc. I think that maybe postmodern liberalism is good enough. Everyone understands. And the fact of the matter is that the other political theories, communism and fascism, they actually failed in their attempt or mission to defeat liberalism. It's a fact. And nowadays, communism and fascism are dead. That's how we see it. Even though we can and should read communist and fascist authors, even though a new political theory can only be built at least partially based on previous political and theoretical constructions, we need to understand the current reality. We are not in the Cold War anymore. We are not in the Second World War. The fact of the matter is that the bankers, these LGBT people and the big corporations, etc., they all obey a single political theory, which is liberalism. Liberalism obviously has many tentacles. So Dugin explains it very well. You can begin, for example, with a theological liberalism, nominalism specifically, the Salamanca School, which was an early defender of free trade and liberalism in
And also
general.
usury too.
Precisely, usury. They paved the way for the Catholic Church to legalize or allow usury around Europe and the world. So you can generally today, people who say they are against liberalism only focus on a specific kind of liberalism. So, for example, leftists in general, social democrats, etc., they say they are against liberalism and they criticize privatizations and free trade or layoffs and the minimum wage problem, etc. But they are completely ignorant to the fact that there are other kinds of liberalism, just like
Yeah, they're just social liberals.
yes, just like rightists. They think that it's possible to be liberal on economics and conservative on social and cultural matters, which is impossible. And nowadays, and Alonso Hall calls it libertarian liberalism. The elite, they are liberal and liberal. They are liberal on economics and liberal on social
Yeah,
matters
like
and cultural matters.
Whig ideology, which if you actually look at the class dynamics of that, that was just kind of a means to overthrow the monarchy. But it created basically like large land monopolies, which means it was just more like an economic interest. But that's how you get like libertarians and conservatives. They're just Whigs.
Yes, for example, the most respected or advanced or progressive leaders today, like Macron or Trudeau, they're obviously defenders of capitalism. They are bulwarks against any kind of social reform or worker
Didn't
right
Macron
reform.
literally work for like a Goldman Sachs bank?
Yeah,
Or no,
Exactly,
or
Draghi,
yeah.
Macron.
he falls under like this thing called like third way liberalism, which shouldn't be associated with like actual third way or third position,
Oh,
but
it's
like
like Tony
third way
Blair.
liberals are basically like neolibs who just privatize the economy very extremely. Then once they have an issue with the economy, they start spending like crazy, like Keynesians.
Yes. So when we understand this, and when we understand, for example, that communism is a current thing, even though there are communist parties in all countries, most countries at least, all of them or almost all of them are liberal. They are for some social state intervention, but in all else, they are liberals. And even we need to understand even some um, communist countries are not currently precisely orthodox communists. Cuba has opened itself some time ago in economic matters. Vietnam the same, Laos the same, and North Korea, for example, even though they are still a closed country of a closed economic, they officially say that they have overcome Marxism, Leninism with their own autochthonous creation, which is
Back in like
sushi.
2009, they got rid of all mentions of like communism, like in any state
Yes,
documents. Then yeah,
exactly. And in China, for example, with Xi Jinping, even though you can say there are actually the Chinese Communist Party has many wings. You could say informal wings, obviously, because formally it's a monolithic party structure, and you have obviously orthodox old guard communists, you have liberals, and Xi Jinping himself is a kind of m- Confucianist Maoist in the sense that he's basically one of the biggest Chinese experts on Confucius nowadays. And his writings, his books, I have read some of them. They are an attempt to synthesize um, Mao Zedong's thought with Confucius' thought. So they are already trying to find a way above or transcending communism and
yeah, it's what
fascism.
Dugan calls the national communists in the for political
Or the
theory.
National Gauchists.
Yeah,
Yes, and the fascists are basically the same. So, which of these current nationalist parties could actually be called an orthodox fascist party? I think almost none of them. Maybe Golden Dawn, and Golden Dawn himself was before being basically outlawed. They, at least some of them, were basically already studying Dugin, for example. So they were already trying to build something new. And Casa Pound more or less is also trying to find a kind of fascism of the 21st century, or fascism 2.0, or something like that. And the other nationalist parties, they are mostly national liberal, so they accept liberal political philosophy, liberal theology, um, but reject other aspects of liberalism. So where could we find actual true fascism, and not just existing, because it's not enough to exist on 4chan or Telegram or YouTube or other places, but in a situation that is able to defy global hegemony, globalism in itself, with a national structure, an army, and soft power, etc. Nowhere. Neither communism nor fascism can do it. So, what Dugin proposes is that each country, or more precisely, each people, should build based on a code analysis of past ideologies, positive points and negative points. Each people should build a new political theory for itself, but to overcome liberalism, which showed that it's the actual incarnation of modernity, this new theory should necessarily be connected, linked to tradition. But tradition isn't a single thing, because Dugin isn't actually a perennialist like Guénon. Dugin thinks perennialism or traditionalism as a kind of meta language. He has a meta linguistic interpretation of genome and of perennialism. So they are actually not a single source of transcendent truth. There actually are many sources. The language, maybe by language Dugin means symbols, symbols, concepts, and some specific ideas. So each people, each folk, or each Dasein als Volk has its own path to tradition, and this new political theory should be a way to give or build a political application of this connection between immanence and transcendence. It's the idea of building a politeia, a kind of Platonopolis, since Dugin also works with political Platonism. It's the idea of building a politeia that is true to a people's own roots and to its path to eternity, or transcendence, theosis, apotheosis, or whatever concept of salvation that each people has. So I think that as a kind of summary, we can say that that's the real fourth political theory.
All right. And how would you say the four political theory say applies to Brazil? Because I know like some people kind of consider like Brazil like a part of like this like huge Hispanic civilization. Then there's some people who kind of have this idea that like say like Latin American countries are kind of like their own thing, their own block that should be separated from like Hispanic civilization. How do you guys interpret that?
Yes, we follow more or less Dugin's works on the concept of civilization. So we consider, for example, that Portugal and Spain are part of the European civilization. And it's important to distinguish between a Western civilization and an European civilization. Obviously, Western Europe is occupied militarily, as a matter of fact, by Western civilization. But there's a true European civilization asleep, or in a kind of zombified state, or something like that, in torpor or something like that, under these ruins of the Western civilization. By Western civilization, guys like Alain de Benoit, or even Dugin himself, when he's being more theoretically precise, he means mostly the Atlanticist, Anglo-Saxon
Yeah,
modern civilization.
the gay empire, the globalist American empire.
Yes, but basically, but Portugal and Spain, even though, and in this, I'm also in agreement with Nova Resistência. Also is part of international alliance with movements from neighbor countries. We call it the CCLA, the Committee for the Central Committee for Liberation of America, which has some other fourth political movements
Like
from
crystal,
Peru.
is crystalism a part of that?
What?
Crystalism with like Israel Lira.
Yes, exactly.
Tempest.
So yes. Also, the Tempestists from Mexico, Crystalists from Peru, There are some guys from Argentina, Chile, etc. So we all considered we all consider Portugal and Spain to be our, civilizational parents, but we don't consider ourselves to be an extension of them, because when the Portuguese and Spanish conquistadors came to America, when they got together with the Indians and later brought slaves, etc., they built something new. So it's its own civilization that most people call Latin American, though we call it Ibero-American. It's naming thing, because we consider the name Latin America to be to have been constructed by the French when they were trying to uh, uh, present themselves as the foremost Latin country in the world, etc., etc. So they gave this part of the American continent the name Latin America, but we reject it for Ibero-America or Hispano-America, etc. So we consider our Brazil, for example, to be a part of a specific civilization that goes from Mexico to Tierra del Fuego, at the southernmost point of the continent. And though we respect the Portuguese and Spanish heritage, uh, for example, we are totally against and we fight against this trend, this North American trend that came to Brazil of toppling down statues, etc. Statues of Portuguese and Spanish governors and conquistadors, etc. But we don't consider ourselves. It would be ridiculous, as a matter of fact, to consider ourselves simply as Portuguese and Spanish people. Obviously, even though when Brazilians or Argentinians or Uruguayans or other of our neighbors, even when they are biologically pure-blooded Spaniards or Portuguese, uh, we are part of something else, because we have, and our ancestors have already adopted many traditions and beliefs and ways of life that either belong to the Indians or are something new that emerged from this interactive dialectical relationship the Europeans had with the Indians and the Africans.
So you don't subscribe to some sort of like luso-tropicalism or something like that?
Yes, more or less, basically.
Hispanic dad canceled. But yeah, I know a lot of Hispanic dad stands, but but yeah, moving on. So I'm assuming that having the like relationships. Sorry, I dropped my phone there, but a lot of the relationships with all these other organizations, obviously, like networking is a good thing, but I'm assuming having these alliances up to is also to kind of like help create a block against like North American influence. Would that be correct?
Yes, we don't consider the possibility, for now at least, of accepting American organizations, North American organizations. But obviously, we try to build bridges like this one we are building right now, bridges with organizations and projects and people from all over the world. For example, the Italian Duginists, or Dugin himself, or French Duginists, or North American students of the fourth political theory, etc.
All right. Well, I do know, like, if you look at, say, like South or just like Latin America in general, Central America, like as far as American influence goes, we've seen the overthrow in Guatemala back when they took on the United Fruit Company. You had Allende when you had Pinochet take power, Perez in Venezuela getting overthrown, then Peron getting overthrown. Castilla is having some issues recently, and he's like one of the more recent leaders within Latin America who kind of took like this like anti-American type streak. And I know there's like Castro is like an obvious case too. So I'm assuming a lot of that too is just to kind of like prevent the United States from interfering within Latin American countries too if anybody gets into power.
Yes, we have a kind of symbolic or mythic interpretation of this relationship between North America and Iberoamerica or Hispanoamerica. Even though I actually have nothing against North Americans as people, as you know, there is also a deep America. There are interesting cultural aspects of America. Brazil received, for example, Dixie immigrants. There are 2 or 3 cities in Brazil which are majority people that fled the south of North America after just after the end of the Civil War. We have the city, for example, of Americana, which it still has they still have some cultural traditions and festivities and holidays that come from Dixieland, we could say, from Confederate America. So even though we respect Americans as people, as citizens, as people with their own traditions and their own ways of life, on a symbolical level, we consider there's a kind of opposition, or a kind of natural opposition between North America as part of the Western civilization and our civilization. Obviously, North Americans can eventually maybe even build a new civilization, and I actually think that would be the path to go, because Western civilization is dead and is going to take with it everyone they can. So we see there's a natural spiritual civilizational opposition that we can trace back to that old Schmittian or Duginian opposition between land and sea, between Rome and Carthage. And that's why, for example, and obviously for many other reasons, we use the idea of a new Rome or of a tropical Rome as a kind of civilizational myth or civilizational symbol. And we consider ourselves to be in a mortal struggle against a kind of new Carthage. So, and actually, Hegel wrote centuries ago about that, for example, there's a kind of natural opposition between North America and South America, especially Brazil. So that's how I think.
Yeah, that basically that opposition existed too in the Confederacy. One of the people who works on my video is a lot pacifist, and he works very closely with E. Michael Jones. But he did an entire video on the Confederacy, and it was very large cultural differences because, like, the South, for example, was more in tune with like blood and soil, I guess you could say, and it was far more aristocratic and it was more agrarian, whereas like the North was more cosmopolitan, industrialized. It was more liberal, then it was also more seafaring, which if you actually look at it nowadays, even like in modern politics, the divides are pretty strong. I used to live in Alabama for a couple of years myself, way more conservative than more self-reliant, whereas you go somewhere like now like Ohio, which is where I currently live, most of the people are like strung out drug addicts and look like 56% face type whites. But yeah, is there anything I want to ask him in solo?
About this, really just I had a question a friend sent me. It was like with regards to like organizing like a fourth political theory organization. What are some of the toughest challenges that you guys have with regards to that?
Okay, so as Zoltanous said, I think that Nova Resistência is one of the few groups that are trying to apply practically the fourth political theory. There's an excellent chapter on Dugin's book about praxis, and uh, uh, Dugin says, for example, that the fourth political the fourth political praxis is uh, a theorizing praxis, and that the fourth political theory was praxis. So there's a kind of dialectical relationship between theory and praxis. So at the same time, we are trying to organize ourselves, we actually need to build a theory, because if you pay attention to Dugin's book, it's basically it's just blueprints. It's a skeleton. It needs to be filled with content, with actual substance by each folk, each design, uh, each collective design. So, well, the first challenge is the size of our country. Obviously, we have in our organization more or less 250 people, but and this is a good number. But when you take into consideration the size of Brazil, for example, the distance from the southernmost point in Brazil to the northernmost point is basically bigger than the distance from Lisboa to Moscow, for example. So our people are spread in the country, and to get people in the same place to participate on something. For example, we have every 2 years we have our national congress. We had one, for example, last year, and we managed to gather 75 or 80 people, more or less. And that's basically, it was the biggest patriotic or more or less nationalistic event in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, for example. So this
Integralists, BTFO.
yes. So for example, we had in Brazil did many mistakes in its own state building, because instead of investing in railways, we invested in roads. So the movement from between states, it's very expensive, and it takes very long. So that there's this first problem. The second problem, it's more general in the sense that nowadays everyone will find it difficult to get young people and to get people in general to get out of the computer of or the TV screen or the social networks to do some work in real life in the streets. For example, we have in our channel we do some live stuff, and sometimes we get uh 4,000 or 5,000 views in a program or something like that. But if we actually try to organize an event or with interesting subject matters and presentations, etc., we know that we will have there something like 30 people or 20 people or 40 people, and even then maybe half of them or two or three of them will want to join our organization. There are always a lot of people who support us, and yeah, you go guys, but they don't actually engage themselves in the struggle. I don't even like politics, for example, but when you pay attention to the current situation in the world, and when you care about your children or your family and the things you believe in and the values you believe in, you necessarily need to do something about it. Maybe it's a kind of spiritual difference, following that Julius Evola cased distinctions. If you have a warrior spirit, a kshatriya spirit, you will want to do something about it. You will want to fight, even if there's no chance of victory. And this is actually something that Evola's uh, interpreters, like for example Freda or Adinolfi, they precisely write that Ride the Tiger isn't a kind of retreat, isn't cowardice. It's a kind of perception that the struggle, the political struggle, has a meaning in itself that shouldn't depend on pragmatic calculations of victory or defeat. Oh, we shouldn't fight because there's no chance of winning. We should fight now because we have a chance of winning. It's like and obviously Evola follows the Bhagavad Gita in this. We should fight because it's our dharma to do so. So even though obviously we need to have a strategy, we need to have tactics, etc., we fight not because we have a chance of winning. We fight because it's in our nature to fight against the globalist hydra or the black dragon, and we could call it APEP, or we could call it with the names of those ancient titans, ancient titanic forces, because we are in an eternal struggle. It's basically we basically are the contemporary actors in epic drama, in an epic cosmic spiritual drama. And I really can't understand, for example, I don't know much about your your debates or polemics with some other guys who call themselves fascists, etc., but are actually capitalists, etc. I don't actually understand how you could call yourself a fascist or a traditionalist and
The
consider
eternal wraith of
yourself,
liberals.
yes, and consider yourself a capitalist, because capitalism is basically an invention of uh I won't call the name. It's basically an invention of the long nose tribe, so how can you call yourself a fascist? It's all part of this we are talking about. For example, you have still in the Italian tradition, you had, for example, guys like Maurizio Latanzio, who was also Evola student, an Evola follower, who writes about aristocratic or Platonic communism, for example. But you won't find a Platonic capitalism, because it's impossible. Capitalism is the economic manifestation of the beast. So getting back to the point about Brazilian challenges, the other challenge is one that is or should be universal to everyone who is trying to apply the fourth political theory in praxis, which is the challenge to build a new Brazilian ideology, rejecting past experiences with communism or fascism, and but we need always to trying to find a national, local, theoretical basis for it. For example, there are always people that follow the third political theory who, for example, read Dugin and say, "Oh, Dugin's okay, but I still consider myself third positionist or etc., because I really like the Falange, or I really like Codriano, or I really like Mosley, or I really like whatever, etc." But the fourth political theory can't emerge out of thin air. So it's always already a presupposition of any application and of any national application of the fourth political theory, that you need to find something in your own country that can serve as this platform to try to overcome the modern aspects of that ideology and to build a fourth political theory out of it. That's why, for example, Dugin said that Peronism is already the Argentinian fourth political theory. Not because Peronism, as it was done in the past, was already perfect or already completely anti-modern or anti-liberal, but because the Argentinian fourth political followers should use Peron's ideas and Peronism as a platform to build the Argentinian fourth political theory, and it can even be called Peronism still. It would be a new Peronism or a Peronism of the 21st century or something like that.
Yeah, that was
And
something I've been talking about, trying to take like the third position, because like they had different, there's obviously different interpretations of it and different philosophies, but trying to completely detach some of its more liberal elements that you can still find within its philosophy, and then moving it beyond into like a capital F fascism, which is basically fused with traditionalism. At least at least that's what like I'm more interested in doing now, like on a personal level. And I also
I
think
would
that
agree.
like when you look at Dugin, his fourth political theory seems to be very, it seems closer to the third political theory than any of the other political theories, if that kind of makes sense.
yes, of course, and he says it explicitly. For example, he says that from the third to the fourth, it's just a step. From the second to the fourth, it's obviously possible, but there are two steps. So, and this is something that I have perceived on a practical level. For example, our organization has a census, and the last time we did a census, we asked from which political theory our comrades had come. I myself come from the third political theory. 15 years ago, I was a kind of, if you could say, a kind of left, of esoteric left fascist. You know, I mixed fascism with Julius Evola and National Bolshevism, something like that, even before I knew Dugin. So when I actually read Dugin of some of Dugin's material, I said, oh, that's what I believe in. But our other comrades, I think that 60 or 70% of them come from fascism, come from the third political theory. Some 20% more or less come from communism, and the other are, you know, either people who are actually too young to have followed another political theory, or one or two crazy comrades who were neoconservative or liberal conservative or something like that. So it's much easier. You already have, for example, the fact that Casa Pound celebrates Che Guevara's memory and Hugo Chavez's memory. You already have something like that. You already have the fact that Ramiro Ledesma from Spain, from Falange, uh, can be considered and is already considered by Spanish comrades as the first national Bolshevik in Iberian Peninsula. You already have guys from Italy, not only Freda, for example, but Nicola Bombassi or Alessandro Pavolini and other Italian fascist thinkers who were actually who actually understood that you can't that there's no possible conciliation with the bourgeoisie, because the idea of a capitalism that is exclusively national only takes into consideration the fact that at that moment, capital still isn't powerful enough to become transnational. So and that's proved by the fact that all big corporations that helped the German war effort and the Italian war effort transcended the national boundaries and became big international and transnational corporations.
Yeah,
So
they were basically working with anybody for profit. I know that like Pepsi, for example, this wasn't during the war, but they made all kinds of economic deals too with the Soviets. Like I believe they exchanged ships for like Pepsi.
yes, so for example, obviously, and this is something that even Mao Zedong can contribute to us in this, because Mao Zedong there's an interesting article from, or speech, I think, from Mao Zedong. In English, it's Mao Zedong, yeah?
Yeah, we just say
Okay,
Mao though for short.
okay. There's a speech from Mao that distinguishes between all the Chinese social classes. And he says that, okay, we are with the peasants and the very small Chinese proletariat at the time, but we also need, obviously, the soldiers, the military, we need the students, and we need to distinguish in the bourgeoisie between a small bourgeoisie and inside the middle bourgeoisie between a national middle bourgeoisie and cosmopolitan middle bourgeoisie.
Oh
So
yeah, I believe what you're getting at is this idea of the provincial bourgeoisie, and then the I think it was the oppositional bourgeoisie, which is something that he actually talks about. I think it was in the clientistic corporatism, which was one of the
yes,
connected to like his new democracy idea for class collaborationism.
is exactly, and it's a different kind of class conciliation in comparison to German or Italian class collaboration at the time, which focused precisely on the kind of opportunistic bourgeoisie that would make deals with everyone. And always emphasize the fact that class collaboration took most fascist leaders to the grave, or almost took most fascist leaders to the grave. Because we can't forget, for example, the fact that Mussolini was betrayed by the right wing of his party, by the monarchists and the
The
pro-capitalist.
only leftist who betrayed him was Armando Rossini. He's the only one.
Yes, it was absolutely absurd, obviously, but well,
Yeah,
uh,
the one thing I always found interesting about Germany's case is that a lot of people say like bring up the Strasser brothers, but Gregor was more in line with like the standard Nazi Party line. Hitler didn't even want him executed. Otto was basically kind of like the Nazis' version of Trotsky and was doing all kinds of like glowy shit. And it was like Goring and Himmler that liquidated Gregor, which they never found out like till after the war, thanks to like Rosenberg's memoirs and some stuff that uh,
And Hitler gave
Statura
he
found,
gave
that Dave Irving found.
yeah, and Hitler gave Gregor Strasser's family like a pension. Like he was really mad once he found out that Gregor was also killed. Like he was going to
Yeah,
make him like head of like some economic department or give him a really big
and
job. Like the
the
idea
whole
of like
reason why Schacht got appointed to in charge of the economy temporarily was because of Goring, and like so like Goring was like really like the most subversive member in the party, in my
yes.
he
opinion.
was just like a power hungry guy, in my opinion.
Yes, and he actually ran Luftwaffe to the ground. There was that other guy who could be a better Luftwaffe minister. I think it was uh, Erhard. I don't know. It was because, for example, Luftwaffe was destroyed basically because they didn't understand that Luftwaffe could act and should act as an independent arm of the Wehrmacht in general. So it only acted as support. It didn't actually apply independent it wasn't treated as an independent arm of the Wehrmacht. And well, basically the Air Force theory or doctrine which prevailed was precisely the one from the Allies, which used the Air Force as a kind of independent arm with its own missions and priorities, etc. But well, Goering was a drug addict, so he was a fat drug addict.
And also, someone in this chat just said Goring was a hungry man. Period, not just for power.
Yes.
But I want to.
Well,
I wanted
okay.
to
I
sort
kind of feel for Robert Lay, because Robert Lay, probably like arguably the most left-wing person in the party, wanted Goring removed, but that never happened.
I guess my problem, like speaking from a third positionist standpoint about Dugin, is like I have read Dugin quite extensively. I have Dugin to thank for a lot of my actual philosophical interests. I even have Dugin to thank for removing me of my lingering sort of libertarianism, especially with his ethno-sociological work, and then removing any sort of methodological individualism and making me think of various collectives as the basis of society, not as the individual. So in that respect, I do have a lot of love and a lot of respect for Dugin. However, I see a lot of his critiques of the third political theory, and I wrote an article on this. People can find, although I'm reworking that article because I wrote it about a year ago, and there's some things I disagree with, and I've changed my mind on now. But I feel like a lot of his criticisms of the third political theory and where he says the fourth political theory can alleviate or needs to correct is unfounded in the sense that he sort of strawmans or maybe he just doesn't understand properly the third political theory. For instance, he if you read, for instance, in like at least in English, the second volume of the fourth political theory, there's like an appendix which talks about which Dugin made, which talks about how the fourth political theory versus the third political theory views, like say, like the concept of the nation. And Dugin claims that that the third political theory views the nation as like an objective factor, versus the fourth political theory has a subjective view of the nation. However, I feel like if you actually look at what actual like NSDAP people and actual like Italian leaders were saying, Italian intellectuals were saying at that time in the war interwar period, they actually had a much more subjective theory of the nation and race than Dugin gives them credit for, as well as Dugin, I think, heavily strawmans the various racial theories that were propagated amongst like the NSDAP, for instance. So I just feel like a lot of his criticism of like the third political theory is just unfounded, and that's why I'm not like I do like pretty much agree like every proposal that Dugin has, pretty much all of his philosophy. I just disagree that it's a radical departure from the third political theory. I just think, properly speaking, if you understand the third political theory in the proper way, then you see that it's much, much closer from the fourth political theory, maybe a few changes here and there, than Dugin actually gives it credit for.
I know, like, A. James Gregor does a pretty good job of like debunking like race, with the National Socialists being like purely like a biological thing. Especially if you go through some of like other like party intellectuals, or say Faith in Action, it says like the primary factor defining race was actually consciousness, so it was like purely psychological.
Exactly, and even if this is something that I've discovered is or maybe not I discovered, but something I've been saying is that Dugin's idea of large spaces of civilization, he gets it from a lot of places, but as you know, one of the biggest geopolitical influences on him is Carl Schmitt and his idea of the, I'm going to butcher the German, the Grossraum, or the large space, the great space. But if you actually look into it, where Carl Schmitt got his idea of a great space actually comes from the Austrian painter himself. And he developed that idea all the way back in like the early 20s, and Carl Schmitt didn't even start talking about that until like the late 30s, like until like I think April of 1939 is when he first developed publicly his theory of the large space. So in that way, you can see like the Austrian painter having directly influenced, or there's like one person in between the Austrian painter and Dugin with regards to influencing on geopolitics, if that makes sense.
I would also argue that Dasein being authenticity, for example, like all those things that come from Heidegger, those are only like really compatible through like exceptionalism. And when I say exceptionalism of a people, it means basically I embody everything about it, because that's what makes you, it's what makes your people. And when you embody that, like for the German case, it's Volkisch ideology, whereas the case of the Italians, it's Romanita. If that makes sense. For for the Russians, it's Eurasia, which goes all the way back to the Tsars, Sternberg, the some of the Russian fascists like Constantine, for example, even some of the left Eurasianists like Ustrelov, who was like a Nazbol. So it's like very hard to define, but you can see continuity.
Yes, well, on this point, I think that what Dugin's trying to point is the fact that even though there were many currents of thought, lines of thought in the major fascist parties or fascist movements, uh, what Dugin's trying to say, or what Dugin thinks, is that maybe the popular face of, or the major face, or the official face of these movements was mostly a kind of modernistic nationalism or something like that. For example, Dugin heavily uses Heideggerian concepts or Heideggerian ideas. The own subject of the fourth political theory is design, for example, or at least one of the major suggestions of a subject. But the fact of the matter is that Heidegger was trying to influence the NSDAP and the Third Reich, but he failed. If Heidegger had managed to become mainstream as ideologue, as a party theorist, a fourth political theory wouldn't be necessary, or at least for the Germans, for example, or in a universal sense, for example. The same could be said about the Italians, in the sense that, for example, Evola's ideas were pretty marginal in Italy. They had some official penetration, some official support, but it was always something really minor. If we take, for example, Franco's Spain, it only used Falange's name, not its ideas. I think maybe the one place where the step from the third political theory to the fourth political theory would be really minor. Maybe it's Romania, because the Iron Guard, was something really traditional,
Like even
religious.
even Evola sort of fangirled over the Iron Guard. He met with Kojeranu once, but even during like the 50s and the 60s, he wrote you can find various passages in his writings where he like sort of fangirls about what the Iron Guard and what Kojeranu was. And
Yes.
I actually have a pretty extensive, it's like a 15,000 word sort of like essay, I guess you could say, going into the ideology of the Iron Guard. And one thing I found is that they did truly have a sort of civilizational concept, especially if you read when they sent soldiers, when they sent their own basically they sent the second and like the third of command of the Iron Guard to fight in Spain against the
Mota and
communists.
Marin.
Yeah, yes, those two. And if you read their letters that they were writing, they had a very civilizational concept of Europe that they thought they were defending, as well as if you combine like their traditionalism and whatnot, I think you have something that is all but in name a fourth political like theory.
Yes, exactly. I never heard Dugin talking about Codriano, etc. I
I know
think
there
that
is. I do have. This is sort of like circumstantial, but
I'm
there
gonna
is a
do a critique on Dugan, actually talking about how closely his ideas are to the fourth to the third political theory.
no. But what I was saying though, just real quickly, is that I think Dugan did read I forgot his name. There was an ideologue I forgot of the Iron Guard who, when Dugan was translating Evola from Italian, that same publishing house was publishing a lot of Iron Guard material as well that he probably would have read.
yes, probably. Was it Konstantin Neuka, or
The publishing house or the person in
the
question?
thinker?
Give me 1 second, I can find it.
but I know that he recently, for example, Dugin said good things and about the Falange. For example, he said that Primo de Rivera's ideas were really close to the fourth political theory. So I think that on this matter, the major thing is this: uh, uh, even when there were interesting currents or lines of
But just
thought.
real quick, Nay Ionescu is the person I was thinking
Ney
of.
Ionesco. Yes, okay. Even when, for example, there were interesting ideas in the NSDAP. For example, there was that very nice map of Europe. I think it's from Saint Luke's book about the French SS or something like that, which shows a kind of a neo-feudal Europe with its capital in a SS castle, and it's an unified Europe, unified continental
But you
Europe.
can find all kinds of stuff of them talking about like a United States of Europe or like a
Yes,
European
but for
empire.
example,
Especially Leon Degrelle.
this was really minor. For example, unfortunately, the the major ideology, the major plan of action uh, f- um, from Hitler was basically it was a kind of German imperialism. It was only too late that they started desperately trying to recruit Slavs, for example, or at least East Slavs. For example, you have the fact that when
Well, from
um
my understanding is that that was largely like just a Hitler thing, and that a lot of people were actually telling him to actually make like promise the Russians like their own like free state away from communism. But it was mostly just like Hitler's sort of, I guess, in a sense, a sort of conservative strain in Hitler himself, rather
yes,
than like the
possibly.
NSDAP in general.
Nowadays we can't actually, know for certain how many members of the party thought this way or that way, but unfortunately, the major uh, school of National Socialist thought um, understood its own ideology in a way that was closer to Julius Streicher than to Martin Heidegger. On a more, for example, the Zweites Buch, the second, the follow up to Mein Kampf, is an actually interesting book, an interesting read, but it was mostly unapplied. Hitler himself didn't follow what he himself wrote. So, and in Italy, it was the same thing. You had, for example, the fact that Mussolini always kept in touch with Bombassi, for example, who was never persecuted by the fascist state. But the socialization of the means of production only went into effect after Mussolini was betrayed by the young fascist leaders, the young right fascist leaders. So I think that when Dugin is criticizing the third political theory, he's basically what he says is valid, basically to the hegemonic or more powerful current of thought that ruled in the Third Reich or in fascist Italy during the bigger part of their existences. But obviously, the fact that Dugin himself uses fascist thinkers or a kind of post-fascist thinkers or para-fascist thinkers like the ones from the conservative revolution or Julius Evola or guys like Peron, for example, who was big friends with Oswald Mosley post-war. As a matter of fact, post-war Mosley also is a kind of proto fourth political theory with his ideas of a unified Europe, with his connections to Jean Thiriart, for example, or to Peron.
I would also
Uh,
say like Francis Parker Yockey probably as
Reamer,
well.
Reamer,
yes.
Otto Ernst Reamer.
So, for example, I think that uh, Dugin's criticisms apply to these major currents of thought, but the fact that he uses also some fascist thinkers as the basis of his thought, shows that he actually pays attention to minority schools of thought inside fascist parties, etc. For example, even on a esoteric level, one of the biggest influences on Dugin is Hermann Wirth, who was the chief of SS Ahnenerbe. So, for example, he has studied hard this subject. In the 70s, he was member of a Russian esoteric group called, I think that it was the Black Order of the SS or something like that. So I think he's know his materials, but on one hand, he needs to be harsh on his criticism, even for example, to convince people not to stay on the third political theory because it's a trap nowadays. Nowadays, it's just a trap, just like staying communist is a trap. So he needs to be harsh, but at the same time, everything that is interesting and good about fascism, Dugin takes it and brings it to the fourth political theory. But well, at the end of the day, sometimes it's just a naming thing.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of our
Mm.
I don't think because I think on like a policy basis or like a point by point basis, me, you, and Zolt probably agree on like 90-95% of the things
I
here. I
still
think
think he's third positioning, that he doesn't call himself one.
yeah, yeah, that's because basically my thing is why would you call yourself if you can, basically only using if you stop time at say 1945 and you can use political ideas from that fascist era to basically come up with a fourth political theory, maybe taking a little bit from Italy, a little bit of Germany, from Romania, Spain, then why would you call it fourth political theory rather than just a more sort of unified third political theory? I think that's really our argument, we would say. I know Dugin does add a little bit more traditionalism. He has his own sort of Russian spin on it with his own special Russian truth, right? But I just don't see why you would say fourth political theory rather than just like, oh, this is just a more completed third political theory. I think that's sort of our main contention here.
I mean, like, if you go through like Russian fascism with like Constantine, for example, like he defined like fascism in the case of like the Russian civilization, it was kind of an exile, is that it had to be Eurasianist. It had to focus heavily on religion and like tradition and empire as being its defining characteristics. And I mean, I know Dugin references him in the conservative revolutionary essay that he has. It's very brief, but he does mention. But the big thing I would focus on would probably be fascism, borders, and red. And I know one of his earlier essays, but he basically talks about like a new fascism, like a capital F fascism that has removed itself from its liberal or more right wing elements that kind of hurt them historically. I don't. I'm sure you've read that one, but I'd like to hear what you would think.
Yes, I have translated this article in Portuguese. Uh, I think, for example, that just like communism is a revision of liberalism, if you take, for example, Marx's basis, they are basically liberal. It's basically
Well, he himself calls himself like a radical bourgeoisie, and he says he wants to like complete the French Revolution.
yes. For example, it's basically David Ricardo's economics with I forgot the other guy's name. It's basically Hegelianism with David Ricardo's economics.
Adam
England?
Some
Smith.
yeah,
Adam
some
Smith,
stuff
yeah.
from Adam Smith and that German philosopher guy.
Feuerbach.
Exactly, and it's basically this: just Hegel plus Feuerbach plus Smith and David Ricardo. At the same time, fascism is a kind of revision on communism. If you, for example, if you remember the fact that George Sorel was one of the biggest influences on the development of fascism, not only in France but Italy, Spain, Portugal. I try to find
Romania to an extent as
Romania,
well.
yes. I
As far
tried
as it
to
goes of
find.
Germany, you can find it more of Rudolf Jung, and that's because he was like a trade unionist and like a council socialist.
Yes, I tried to find something about Sohail in Germany, but I didn't actually find some influence.
Yeah,
But
you would probably find
there,
this interesting. Rudolf Jung was actually pen pals with Edward Berth from Circle Proudhon, and something I also found interesting is like the German National Bolsheviks used the same logo as Circle Proudhon, but the one of the groups, I think it was the author Dr. Tafel, who is a trade union like guild socialist, uh, who also supported like worker councils, who was like a big influence on Jung. Jung would attend conferences that had some of these like German National Bolshevik thinkers. It also had Otto Strasser, and then some conservative revolutionaries like Junger were attending these conferences. And I only know about this because I was on the website Arplin and I was reading some of the articles that are on there.
it's a great site. But my point is that just like uh, each theory is a kind of revision on the previous one. The fourth political theory, in my interpretation, is a kind of traditionalist revision. It's national Bolshevik and traditionalist revision on fascism. But it always the question always remain, when can you say actually that a new theory has been born. So I think this is a point of contention. I think that the fourth political theory actually has a claim of existence. I think it's perfectly valid, but I think that we shouldn't discard or ignore neither communism, neither fascism. I think they are perpetual sources of erudition and of self.
I do have an
Uh,
interesting point. You know who Eugene Weber is, right? Like an historian.
no, no, no.
Oh well, he has like a book called Varieties of Fascism, and when he talks about like communism and fascism in there, he traces them back to the Jacobins more specifically, which is I guess is where you can kind of say that it's liberal because they both start with the Jacobins. But if you think about it, like the more radical types, kind of like following Robespierre in a way, are kind of like the prototypes to like what would later become like communism, whereas like Bonapartism, which is something that Karl Marx would constantly bitch about because it was reactionary, is basically where you get like early fascism, at least with like a Bonapartism. The
Well,
problem with
Bonapartism,
Bonapartism is it's
it's not
basically like a
ideological. It's
yeah,
not
it's
ideological.
not it's
It's
not like
authoritarian, but not totalitarian.
yeah, well, it's considered like the proto start of it because like but what I'm getting at is like some people like say like Ivan Ilyin, who is like one of these like Russian traditional conservative like orthodox thinkers. His big critique of like say fascism is because like this Bonapartist element that it was like Caesarism and which made it godless and it would basically do whatever it would want and it was about absolute power which made it relativist and all this stuff which is why he calls it liberal.
Uh, I don't precisely know, but Christian Boucher has an article that traces the origins of the nationalist revolutionary, the French nationalist revolutionary current of thought, which basically is a kind of it's basically French national Bolshevism. He traces it back to the Jacobins too. On Bonapartism and Caesarism, I don't know if I'd agree with this analysis. Well,
Well,
uh,
Ilian was, you know, when he critiqued fascism this way, he was actually a collaborator with the Germans and Italians. Then after the war, uh, he was still influential, like in white immigrant circles, and he he's considered influential within Russia nowadays. I believe Dugin is actually influenced by him to a degree, but he's not like I would say he's completely correct. He's basically just like a modern Joseph de Maistre, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, I think the comparison is correct. I know that Evola, for example, criticized Bonapartism too, precisely from this perspective that it's kind just like a kind of Machiavellian political strategy. Uh, I wouldn't agree. I think, for example, that Adriano Romualdi, who was one of Evole's students, his favorite student, as a matter of fact. He has a more precise, a more, I think, a more realistic evaluation of at least of Bonaparte himself. Obviously, Bonapartism as a political phenomenon of 19th century Europe, maybe it did actually become this kind of pragmatical Machiavellism, for example, with Napoleon III. But Bonaparte himself, I think what he actually was trying to do was, at least unconsciously, restore tradition in Europe. He tried to unify Europe. He crowned himself in the same tradition as the Ghibelline emperors, like Friedrich the First, Friedrich of Hohenstaufen, for example. And I actually think, for example, that one of the biggest tragedies of Europe was the fact that the Guelphs defeated the Ghibellines in their struggle. The Ghibellines, for people who don't know, they were basically those who believed that the emperor wasn't simply a kind of temporal power, but that the emperor also was a spiritual authority, just like the Byzantine emperors, the Eastern Roman emperors. It's what they called Caesaropapism, but it's a pejorative way of calling it. It's basically the traditional kingship. In the traditional kingship, the 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 major source of spiritual authority isn't the Pontifex Maximus or the priestly caste, etc., or a kind of high priest. It's the emperor. So, for example, but well, I think that Bonaparte tried to restore this kind of perception. Maybe he saw himself as a successor from the Holy Roman emperors, the traditional ones, even
You'd
though he
probably find
actually
this
ended.
interesting. There's actually a book called Hitler's Teutonic Knights that actually makes that same case, but with Hitler. But it's like a whole different conversation.
Yes, yes. These are many, many, many subjects, as a matter of fact.
I would disagree, but I don't. My view of Napoleon is much more like pessimistic. I think he was just a more like a reactionary bourgeoisie who wanted to sort of like control the excesses of like the French Revolution and whatnot. And I think that to the extent that he was like a traditionalist is just to the extent that he had those sort of vestigial remains in him. Um, like I think if you actually look at his policies, like what he did when he conquered areas, like
Harry
his
Bolton actually referred to him as a liberal capitalist because he did not bring back the medieval guilds. Instead, he just kind of like laissez-faire the economy.
And also, if you look at like what he did when he conquered areas, like his like liberations and his sort of like liberal nationalism that he spread all over Europe. I do like the. I think he was trying to unify Europe, and I do sort of respect like continental Europe, and I do sort of respect that. But I think he went about it in like ideologically the wrong way, and I do like.
It's a
I know if we had
contradictory
Pacifist
figure.
here, he would be defending Napoleon really hard
Well,
right
he's
now.
like, oh, he destroyed the Masonic lodges. It's like, yeah, that's just because like it wasn't for any ideological
He
reason.
considered him in a struggle with like Judeo-Masonic Anglo
Well,
civilization.
he liberated the Jews though. Like I think Jews are right for praising him because if you look at what he did, he like liberated them, gave them the best. It's a different conversation, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I had one guy wanted to ask me. He's really big on Dugan, but he wanted me to ask what your thoughts on communist left-wing nationalist insurgencies that are going on in Colombia, Peru, and Paraguay.
He wants me to talk something about that.
Oh, I'm
Well,
gonna respond to this really fast. Uh, Read his essay on the corporatist answer. He basically talks, I believe it's the corporatist answer, but he basically disavows Napoleon for not bringing back the guilds and using like an early form of laissez-faire. But yeah, the other guy wants your opinion on the left-wing insurgency is going on in Colombia, Peru, and
Like
Paraguay.
Shining Path, stuff like that.
oh, these are mostly shit, basically. Uh, yes, it's as simple as that. For example, the FARC in Colombia nowadays, they're basically drug dealers. We had a comrade which fought in Donbass, Raphael Varg. He was part of Donbas militia, and before that he was for some months a part of the Colombian FARC. And he says nowadays they are basically drug dealers. There's no ideology, as a matter of fact. The Shining Path is terrible. I basically don't know any kind of comrade of nationalist, etc., which considers the Shining Path a valid organization. They basically actually just practice senseless terrorism against peasants and workers, etc. Um, the nowadays these
Sounds like those
insurgents,
Filipino like Maoists kind of.
yes, nowadays these insurgencies, they are either totally only superficially ideological, like the FARC. They are simply just a kind of another cartel, or they are basically a kind of communist ISIS, like the Shining Path, which basically is just kills people randomly just to practice terrorism and destabilize the country, etc. So I think that guys like Castillo, not necessarily Castillo himself, but this new breed of leaders who are trying to populist leaders who have rightists and leftist aspects, like Pedro Castillo. Even though Castillo himself he has some problems in the way he has led the country, but more on a speech level. He has basically alienated his own basis, for example. So that's why he's under threat of impeachment nowadays. But if you take his example of a kind of new Chavist wave, but not necessarily Chavez, because he also had some failings, for example. But there's a kind of new wave of leaders, of populist leaders, who are conservative on social and cultural and moral matters, and who are social democratic or socialistic on economic matters. And these are the guys that actually are interesting. They are not the majority of the political candidates in Latin American countries, but the political expectations of the populations in our continent is basically trying to find these kinds of leaders like Castillo, for example, and who are basically the antithesis of guys like Boric from Chile, or the new guy in Colombia, Gustavo Petro, etc. But I think globally, the guerrilla wars and the insurgencies are mostly dead. Even Hezbollah, for example, has institutionalized itself. Hezbollah nowadays is basically a kind of uh, para state, a kind of social apparatus that offers social services to citizens, etc. And its militant wing is basically a bulwark against Israel. So not even then are fighting an insurgency in their own country anymore for some years, as a matter of fact. Um, Even Donbass, for example, could only resist because of unofficial support from Russia. So I think that nowadays um, guerrilla warfare is something that isn't the best path for a political revolutionary movement.
This would be an interesting one. Thoughts on Carlos Ladar, the Colombian drug lord slash neo-Nazi guerrilla fighter?
The Jackal.
Yeah,
Ah,
he worked
okay.
close with Escobar.
Well, I think he's an interesting guy. I was trying to interview him. I think that Christian Boucher has his prison address. I actually tried to interview Ted Kaczynski, but the prison never answered me. I'm probably
He's
now
also like
being.
now dying of like cancer right now.
Yes, I tried to interview him some years ago, but I never got. I think that
If you
my
want to
my
interview someone who is very similar to Ted Kaczynski and has studied him quite extensively and a lot of personal contact, Chad Haig on YouTube, he's pretty easy to get a hold of, and I think he would love to talk to you.
Okay, yeah, I write it down.
He's
So
where he published my first video on Dugan that has like 70,000 views before I had my YouTube channel.
nice. But about Carlos, I think he's innocent. That's one point. I think he's innocent of his accusations, and actually a kind of national Bolshevik in some sense, unconsciously. It's an interesting guy.
All right. Is there anything you want to ask Mansilla?
Yeah, so I have this theory I kind of want to run across with you with regards to like Dugan. So I think that Dugan, in a lot of ways, kind of reminds me of like Oswald Spengler in the sense that in the sense that they're both reactionary in a similar way. Spengler, he has this sort of like almost like deterministic cyclical cycles of history, while Dugan, he famously says that the future is open, and there's just you just have to have a way to actualize if you as a people can sort of actualize yourselves and you can create your own future, right? So it's not necessarily cyclical, although he does believe in somewhat of a cyclical eternal return, but anyways, I think they're both reactionary in the sense that Spengler wants to prevent his group of people or a group of people from turning into a civilization, as he calls it, and keep them at the level of culture, which he views as this vital thing, that's something that it's good, whereas culture is decadent and it's prone to it inevitably must collapse. I think Dugan, in the same way, can be seen as a sort of reactionary in the sense that if you look at his ethno-sociological theory, where he starts with the ethnos, then it goes into the narod or the folk or the volk or the and then it goes into like civil society, and then and so on and so forth. I think that Dugan wants basically Russia with his Eurasianism, but also in general, I think he tells people that their own fourth political theory should be about trying to keep their civilization at the stage of the Narod or the Volk or the Folk, the stage after the ethnos stage, so the one derivative away from the ethnos, and not be something else like civil society or post society or I forget the other names he has. But do you think it's appropriate to view Dugan in that way as a sort of reactionary?
I liked your comparison because basically his criticism of the nation state or the national state is basically this one. It can be put side by side with Spengler's analysis of the civilizational stage, even though they are using different concepts, etc. I think that what Dugin's trying to project is a kind of empire able to restore a kind of normalcy. And since Dugin considers time as a kind of subjective aspect, as a feature of human consciousness, and not as something that objectively exists, I think Dugin considered it possible to, even though community will keep um, dialectically interacting with other communities, etc., but outside of a kind of line of automatic progression. Well, there is also the fact that Dugin, as an Orthodox, uh, maybe he's basically trying to build, the empire of the end of times or something like that. So, what he actually thinks about on how should resurrected empire or community go on about itself, how it should develop, etc. It's actually hard to envision. Uh, Returning to Spengler, and this is something that it's very interesting. It's a pity that he didn't manage to analyze China in detail. because I think that for Europeans specifically, because Ibero-Americans or Latin Americans, we are actually trying to give birth to a new culture slash civilization, or more precisely, a culture in the Spenglerian sense. But
There's actually
China,
yeah, there's actually an interesting thing. Like the main guy who heads the Oswald Spengler Society, like he's like an active academic in Belgium. He actually argues that Spengler got China wrong, and he says that I forget what dynasty he puts it at, but he says like there's actually two Chinese civilizations. And that
yes, precisely. The point is that I think that China showed that it's possible to go through the complete cycle and be reborn in itself, and just basically, okay, the civilization died, so we just build a new Chinese civilization, and that's an important thing to for us to think about, or more specifically, Western people and Europeans, because you can't avoid a civilization, you can't avoid it from dying, but at least I think China shows that it's possible to, from a dead civilization, build a new culture without it not being European. It doesn't need to stop being an European civilization. It just is going to be a completely different European civilization.
Yeah, David Engels is the guy that I was referring to. He runs the modern Oswald Spengler Society. I heard him on a podcast talking about that. I think you can probably also argue maybe Japan also did the same thing with like Meiji Restoration or something like that. I'm not too sure specifically, but no, I would agree with your point there.
Yeah, I was gonna ask this. So, we had that debate that we did more like kind of like it was more like a conversation than debate actually with like infrared. But I remember sending you some of the stuff from that guy like regarding Dugan. So like, part of having you on here to kind of like clarify what Dugan thinks. So all right. So do you think that Dugan's views are like leading towards Marxist Leninism? Is that something that some MLs kind of like Caleb Maupin have been saying?
No, not at all. I think that Marx's contributions are invaluable. Everyone should read Marx. For example, most of my criticism of immigration is based on Marx criticism of immigration as the reserve army of capital, of immigration as a kind of strategy to disintegrate labor unions and lower down wages, for example. I think that we should, the major communist thinkers, we should all read, all, even those who are not a part of the fourth political theory, even fascists should read, are Marx, Lenin, Gramsci, and Mao Zedong. These four guys, you can't actually, understand how capitalism works, and even how
What do
to
you find
order.
valuable of like Lenin specifically? Like, I mean, I've read quite a bit of Lenin. I just don't really find anything really interesting from him. I think a lot of it's just kind of like rewording Marx, like State and Revolution, for instance. It's just like him basically just like quote mining Karl Marx, for instance. I mean, I don't know
Yeah,
what.
my impression too is like Elon Marx might predict the outcome that's bad. He's more or less praising it, really. So he's arguing that it's a good thing. So like, I mean, like, there's better like anti-capitalist sources, like say like Werner Sombart, for example, that people could like study. But I mean, I guess not.
Yeah,
Or like with Marx, instead of him, you could look at like say like Doreen, for example, because like they co-opted scientific socialism from him. They're
yeah.
actually the real utopian socialists.
On Lenin, I think that that book, I think in English it's What Has to Be Done or something like that. It's a very important read. His theory on imperialism is very interesting, and the way he has adapted Sorel's ideas to Marxism, in the sense of his departure from the Second International, which was extremely deterministic, and his understanding of myth as a mobilization force. But besides that, besides the fact that we should read these major Marxist authors, I think that Dugin's going precisely on the opposite way of Marxism, because Marxism is strongly materialistic philosophy. For example, even if we um, try to find some classical Greek basis for some of Marx's understanding of matter, Democritus and Epicurus, for example, Dugin considered Democritus a Satanist, basically. So even if we try to connect Marxism with ancient philosophy, the ancient references that Marxists utilize, they are basically considered by Dugin as being representatives of the logos of Cybele, the logos of Cybele, which is basically this idea of materialistic, dark, matriarchal thinking, for example. So I think that obviously we should read other thinkers like Zombat, for example, but we should also read Marxists, but they are more useful in their materialism. As a matter of fact, it's a tool. It's basically a tool among other ones. We can analyze reality through phenomenology or through a theological understanding of the world, and materialism is just another tool. The problem with Marxists is that they think that because they can explain some aspects of capitalism and some aspects of the bourgeois society, they think, for example, that they can explain the Crusades with materialism, or that they can explain ancient Rome with materialism, or that they can explain religion through materialism. And this is just a kind of blindness, just like all other major philosophical currents of the 19th century, or a kind of blindness, like Comte's positivism or Freudism in general, etc., because they were all reductionists in the sense that they managed to understand a single partial relative aspect of reality, and they thought that they could and that this single factor was enough to explain everything. So but
Yeah, that's
well,
for instance, like when we talked to that basically I called him like a national gauchist. That's basically what he is. He's one of these guys who claims to be an orthodox Marxist, even though he's what Dugan will call like a national communist who just
Well,
denies that
one
he's.
thing that's interesting is
Wait,
that
just real quick, just
he
real quick.
believes that when Lenin is talking about matter, or like when Marx talks about matter, it means essence, like in the
Yeah,
Platonic
that's
sense.
what I was gonna say.
no, there's a kind of metaphysics in Engels, for example, and there were some attempts to build Marxist physics, but it's a kind of materialistic metaphysics. It's a metaphysic, a kind of metaphysics that Dugin himself would consider Satanist or matriarchal or feminine in this evolution sense. For example, I've been participating on some classes on Greek physics, on traditional physics, Aristotelian physics and Platonic physics, that Dugin is given in Italian. And one of the major things that Dugin's trying to show is precisely the many ways that you can see matter. So, for example, you can uh, understand matter from the nous, from spirit, from the central point of being, And from this standpoint, matter is something that is very relative. That is something that is is always becoming, and it's something that is something that is derivative, and it doesn't really has a kind of, for example, matter without form is something that it's inconceivable in this sense. But if you try to understand reality through the standpoint of matter, then matter obviously becomes the only reality. So I think that,
Yeah, it's like physicalism, basically.
yeah, so I think, for example, that even on a metaphysical level, that some Marxists try to build, Dugin wouldn't agree. He would say that what he actually thinks, it's the exact opposite in the way that he sees reality. Obviously, he thinks that Marxists' analysis of capitalist society, of late stage capitalism, of consumer society, etc. These are all good and all interesting, and we should read and should use them. But you can you it isn't fourth political theory.
I just want to say I'm glad you found something useful out of Lenin, because like even if you read like what is to be done, as it's called in English, like that was written when the during a time of, I think, when the Communist Party, the RS, I forget what it's called, the party that Lenin was a part of was basically banned and like underground and illegal in Russia. But once it got like legalized, and like Lenin was like doing certain things, like people were like criticizing him, and they're saying, "Hey, look, if you read What Is to Be Done, you're contradicting yourself." And then he's like, "LOL. I wrote that under the conditions of assuming the party was illegal." So I just feel like even What Is to Be Done is very like it's a very dated book. Like, yeah, I think it even like out.
I find that interesting too, like new
Yeah.
economic policy. He basically bitched about the czarist monarchy in Germany being state capitalist, but then when he gets into power, he immediately implements state capitalism
Yeah,
to
so
try and modernize
yeah,
Russia.
exactly. So in that sense, I don't really find like value in like Lenin per se. Maybe some stuff in Marx. I think he has some
His
interesting stuff.
definition of imperialism too, like in the highest stage of capitalism, is also ridiculous because he basically defines it as something that's exporting capital. So in that very special snowflake definition, only like countries, like say if you take over another country, you take their resources. That's like an example of like capitalist imperialism. But in that super special definition, even the Soviet Union was doing that when it annexed like most of Eastern Europe and went into like these other Middle Eastern countries and started fucking around with them.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
I,
it's
I,
all
I
point.
actually think that Soviet Union was an imperialist country, at least
Oh yeah.
from Khrushchev
But
onward.
definitely.
For example, if you take into consideration the economic relationship between Cuba and Soviet Union, obviously, of course, we can understand the fact that Cuba had no other options, obviously, and Castro himself was not a Marxist. During the revolution, he was basically a kind of patriotic Cuban. He was
It's like a
more of a
phalangist.
follower of, yes, he was more of a follower of Jose Marti, and he was actually educated by a phalangist priest. There were,
Lorente.
yeah, there was a guy from late Falange who traveled to Cuba, and some Cubans said he met Castro, and Castro said, "Oh, you should go to Che Guevara's house because and take a look at the library there because you'll find something interesting." And he found there the complete works of Primo de Rivera that were gifted to him by Spanish politicians, and there were a lot of annotated stuff on the by Castro on the books. So, but well, if you analyze Cuba's economic relationship with Soviet Union, it was obviously it wasn't in equilibrium. It was obviously in a in a situation where, from a Leninist point of view, um, it was an imperialistic relationship between Soviet Union and Cuba. Obviously, more advantageous than being under U.S. influence, obviously, but it was still imperialism. But well, it's an interesting definition of imperialism and of a kind of capitalist structure. I think that we can nowadays talk about globalism as the last stage of capitalism, as a matter of fact. But it is something else.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, what do you think about like what would your advice be for us North Americans, especially people who if not, fourth political theory, people who, obviously, someone like me or, Zoltanous, who are very, very close to fourth political theory. As I said, I think we could probably agree, like, 90-95% of things we agree on. Because, for instance, Dugan, I forget which, I think it's like Eurasian Mission or maybe another book. He's basically like, yeah, you Americans are kind of like screwed. He's like, basically the options it gives us, like, you can either become Mormons or you can just like be like Ezra Pound or like Father Seraphim Rose and just adopt a very like continental European attitude. But he's very like pessimistic. What would you say are the sort of prospects for a sort of discovering an American Dasein, if you will?
Balkanize, tear it all down, blow it up, blow it all up. That's what I would say.
Blow it all up is always an option. But well, North Americans have some serious difficulties moving forward. Um, I think that the first thing is to organize. Obviously, you always have to be afraid of stuff like infiltrators and the FBI and the CIA, etc. But this shouldn't stop North Americans to try to create something in real life. What form should it take? I couldn't say for sure. I think that obviously you shouldn't follow on the footsteps of guys like, for example, that Trad Workers Party or something like that.
Yeah, Matthew Heimbach.
Yeah, that ended on a trail park, cocoding stuff.
Hey, he's got a brand new group.
They call it the Night of Wrong Wives.
Yeah, but yeah, real talk though. He actually has a new group. They use the name Patriotic Socialist, New Black Front, and also National Bolshevik Front interchangeably.
I think that especially in America,
pretty memey.
Exactly. Obviously, on the internet, it's interesting to do edgy stuff and stuff like that.
I just got to say really fast, like, doesn't matter what ideology you are in America. In America, everything is made into a product that you can buy and sell, and all these different ideologies are a special lane, but they all converge into a circus, and that circus is called Clown World.
Unfortunately, yes. But if you actually want to do something about it, I think that there's some way to try to capitalize on Trumpism in some sense. Try to radicalize it in some sense. There's a populist tradition in North America. Father Coughlin and Huey Long and stuff like that, and Ezra Pound himself.
Everyone is the mystic Pelly.
Yeah,
the new prophet walking through walls.
Trump on discourse level, pre-presidency Trump, during some time there, he was talking some interesting stuff to people from the Rust Belt and to workers and so there's maybe a small possibility of trying to get Trumpism to be more radical, radicalize Trumpism in this populist sense of obviously there's being North American, you have to take into consideration the fact that the people have a stupid reaction to words like socialist or fascist, etc. But taking this into consideration and adapting to, you know, some symbols and stuff like that, maybe something can be built. Or the other options, basically balkanization, you know, separatism, try to at least maybe on smaller sizes North America would be, no, be able to heal itself or something like that. But on a spiritual and civilizational level, it's basically an effort to build a new culture, you know. It's a Prometheus effort, it's a Titanic effort,
The
it's
South will rise again.
yeah, maybe who knows.
I guess
Who
like
knows?
my question was like, do you think, yeah, kind of going back to like more on a theoretical level, like, do you think that us as Americans should try to because I know for me, like it would be like real like as like an Orthodox person, it'd be like relatively easy for me to just like LARP as like a sort of like continental European, like Father Seraphim Rose or something like that, as like Dugan sort of suggests, like sort of like take up like a an old world identity or whatever. But like, do you think that us Americans should try to create our own like American civilization, or like maybe reconnect with like a European civilization, or like I guess on a civilizational level, like what would
Only
you
reason I see that
recommend?
as a meme with America is because even though you have real cultural elements, quote unquote, those are just baggages from Europe. So it's technically just an echo of a real
Yeah,
culture.
well, that's
And then the
what I think.
American culture itself is created literally by like Anglo Masons and then like long nosed people. So
Well,
everybody who is American is basically a Masonic Jew Angloid, no matter what they
okay.
do.
Well, I think that also like presents like because we do not have those deep roots,
Same with Canadians.
because we don't have those like deep roots, we're able to sort of like wipe the slate clean, and or it's much easier to start over from nothing. In that sense as well, though. So there's also like a positive aspect to what you're saying there, Zol.
Yeah. Uh, well, I can think of one more big question I need to ask because you do have people who share this stuff. So, Brandon Martinez, the racist liberal king himself, a lot of these people will share quotes of Dugan saying that he wants to exterminate the white race and then repopulate Europe with non-whites, and that he wants like global communism. So, I just want to hear what a representative of the fourth political theory has to say.
That's
And
very
this is probably
stupid.
going to get clipped, by the way.
It's very stupid because obviously, for example, Dugin's favorite thinkers are Germans and Italians and French. uh, Dugin spent most of his youth basically reading European poetry and, you know, reading European philosophy. Um, uh, he traveled most European countries. There's some stuff about Dugin's relationship with some movements from Spain and France that I couldn't say publicly because it precisely would be the kind of thing that maybe if he said in Germany he would be arrested, for example, because he was rolling in the early 90s with some pretty radical nationalistic third positionist movements in Europe.
Pontiac
Uh,
boy.
yeah, Pamiat.
Russian national unity inside the Donbass ruling party nowadays.
Yeah, and in Spain, he was friends with the Sedadi guys, and Sedadi were the guys who were connected in Latin America with Miguel Serrano, for example. So he he actually loves Europe. Now, people take some quotes out of context from, you know, weird old interviews when he says, for example, that he supports Freemasonry in Poland and stuff like that, and Poland should be
But I could do
destroyed.
that with reneging on, and then you would find, oh, okay, he was a Mason. But like, I mean, if even if you looked at say like Masonry, say in Prussia, for example, Prussian like Masonry was extremely anti-Semitic, whereas like British Freemasonry was very Jewish. If that makes sense. So there was very two different interpretations of Masonry that were going on right here. And when most people are critical of say Masonry, it's usually Anglo-American Masonry.
Yes, precisely. I got now. In relation to these immigration matters, etc., Dugin basically believes that Europe is for Europeans, and there's no question about that. He has written lots of articles in which he criticizes immigration. He supports, for example, anti-immigration parties in Europe. All his European allies are anti-immigration nationalists. So I think that these attacks on him are vile because if you want to criticize Dugin, there are a lot of theoretical aspects on his works that are incomplete or maybe it should be worked better.
Oh,
And
dude, I showed some of his stuff to my grandfather, who's like a really religious like Baptist, and he started calling him a relativist because of his views on different tradition. Because my grandfather believes like an objective religious tradition and thinks that everything is not Christian is wrong. So it's just an interesting corollary.
yes, for example, so if you want to criticize Dugin, there are a lot of stuff you could criticize, but lying just to, make him into a kind of devil or something like
The
that.
Joker from Batman.
Yes, that's
Chaos.
really stupid. Yes, that's stupid because these lies are easily refuted. For example, that stuff about Zimbabwe or something like that, or for example, I saw someone on here on the chat asking about that quote about black people in Russia or something like that. Well, the problem was that in that interview they asked about one or two or a few black people going to Russia, etc. Well, uh, Pushkin was part black. So if you are talking about one, two, three, or a bunch of people who actually assimilate and actually can contribute to the country, well, actually, even the Third Reich gave citizenship to some mixed people and stuff like that. As Goering used to say, "I'm the one who decides who is a Jew and who isn't a Jew." So, but if you ask Dugin, okay, but what if 100 million Africans wanted to go to Russia, etc.? Obviously, he wouldn't say it's okay. So it's a matter of perspective, I think.
I also think you have to take into account that the Russian nation's always been like multi-ethnic because it's always been an empire, and
But it's multicultural. It's like multicultural, but in like the true sense of the word, where all like
they
cultures
have
are
autonomy.
respected. Yeah, they're all
Yeah,
respected. Unlike America, where the goal is like a monoculture, where everyone's just in this like sort of mocha like monstrosity. In Russia, it's about preserving like each one more or less, and like respecting other
yeah. It goes
traditions.
all the way back to the Tsar, the Russian fascists, the Nazguls. It was even assimilated into the Soviet Union, but like I mean, people just focus on that and be like, "Oh, just because like the Soviets did it, that means that they want like Mongoloid bastards like raping Europe and stuff," which is obviously just like a dumb straw man.
Yes, precisely. So I think that we can ignore this kind of people. Obviously, they should be criticized and
And also, just real quick, a lot of those stuff is like from like 2000 and like the late 90s. And I know like most people like posting that stuff weren't even born during that time. So just think about like how long ago a lot of those like views are.
I mean,
yes,
like they even post stuff from like Dugan, like Crowley, and that like
yes.
he's not even into that stuff anymore.
Yeah, I was going to mention precisely Crowley. For example, people posting a video of his from I think it's 1994 or something like that, and these people weren't even born at the time. And well,
A lot
obviously,
of these people like 5 years ago were just like liberals or conservatives or something.
yes, or communists even. At the time, and Dugin's very open about this. He wasn't even a Christian at the time. His conversion, I think, was in 1998 or 1999, for example. So, well, a lot of people were into occult stuff and stuff like that, even fascists and people like that. So, it's very stupid. I think And Dugin
You
doesn't
know, I
even
actually
like.
had an esoteric Hitlerist bitching about that one time. An esoteric Hitlerist of all people.
Yeah, it's very dumb. I Dugin doesn't even like talking about himself because he thinks that he should be criticized for his ideas, and the only thing that's interesting in him are precisely his ideas, his theories, the fourth political theory, the nomachia, political Platonism, ethnosociology, etc. So the fact that these people are so focused on taking one or two quotes out of context, and then they make a video and put Hava Nagila Hava song, and make memes, etc. It's just so empty.
Also, the person to like, I don't know if you knew this, Raphael, but the first person to really push the sort of like Dugan scare in America was Glenn Beck, who's this like bottom of the bucket intellectual, like conservative who was on like radios a lot, and he's not very
He
intellectual
attacked Trump
whatsoever.
for being a Russian asset, but
Yeah, like he's very bottom of the barrel when it comes to like intellect. He's not very
oh yeah,
smart at
another
all.
one would be Berkness. Berkness is like this. Pacifist has actually debated him, but Berkness believes that Hitler was like a Bolshevik asset that was meant to destabilize all of Europe, which would allow the communists to come through and then take over everything. And that Hitler did not die, and he actually fled to the Soviet Union, and then that
Okay.
modern third positionists and national Bolsheviks are all created by Duginism, and that Duginism is actually controlling Soros to destabilize the West and exterminate the white race, basically.
Okay, that's an interesting conspiracy theory. I
Yeah,
didn't know that Hitler was alive in Soviet Union.
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
he's actually still alive, like today, like this very day.
yeah, he's just in Argentina.
He's hanging out with like
Yeah.
Edward Snowden in Russia.
And Dr. Mengele. Oh man. But
We
yeah,
should
I
have
guess
you have you back. I would like to talk about like Nohamakia and some of the more deep cuts of Dugan that a lot of people don't really
we need to get
aren't
Dugan
familiar
on.
with. Yeah, I would love to get Dugan on, but or even his English translator Michael Millerman, but his responded to my emails. But
Yeah, I know. Like I asked him for his thoughts on some stuff we've written, but he just leaves me on red. Not a nice man. But yeah, is there anything else you want to ask Mansilla?
no, I think we're at the 2 hour mark.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I have some more stuff, but it would just take forever. So I think we should maybe in the future get something else going. Maybe get some more deep dives into actual like Duganist theory. I
Okay.
think that would be pretty fun.
And anything else you want to say, Raphael?
Just I think that we should concentrate ourselves on the fact that um, globalism is the real enemy nowadays. I think that we should, if you are a third positionist, I think that you should sit down, study theory, and try to analyze critically your own political theory. And even if you doesn't like the number four, if you are honest about this revision, this theoretical revision, you'll be on the same page as Dugin. So it doesn't matter the name you use to call your ideology, etc. I think that if you understand the liberal essence of modernity and postmodernity, and if you're willing to fight against it, and if you understand the failures of the past ideologies, and if you want to uh, you know improve upon it, to create something better, even if you keep calling by the ideology by the same name and following the same historical characters, etc. I think even if you don't actually like the fourth political theory by name, if you are willing to do it, and I think that most people here on this channel are willing to do it, you are already on the same page as the fourth political theory and Dugin, etc. And that's what matters, because at the end of the day, it's an existential struggle against actual devilish people, Satanists. Alonso Hall calls it necro-satanic pedophile cabal elite of parasitical
The
nomads and
Antichrist
stuff like that.
explosion.
So if we are fighting against it, so it doesn't actually matter the name we use to call ourselves. So we all should get together and try to, improve upon all these ideologies we like to study, phalangism, legionnarism, and all of it, to give tools, theoretical tools to all peoples, to all our peoples, so they can fight and survive. And besides that, I'd like to one more time thank you for the invitation, and have a good night.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Everybody have a nice night. I'm gonna play out the outro. We'll pick a funny one.